got some requests from you guys to paint something white. White is sort of a perpetual request. Whenever I put it out there every month, I either get white or glass, right? So because these are things that are not only very cool to see in other people's paintings when it's done well, but it's really, really satisfying when you can pull it off in your own work. So I totally understand, you know, why these things keep coming up. They are challenging. And I don't know that I want to say they're fun to paint. Are white objects and glass objects fun to paint? No. Not really, but when you can pull it off, it's so very satisfying to create that illusion. And because, you know, we artists know how difficult it is to paint white without just taking your white tube and, you know, graying it down 4 levels and using that, you know, bringing the colors that are around it into that white and portraying that. That's very satisfying when you can pull it off. And the other request that I got from Sonia was to paint some, and Kathy, I think, was to paint some foliage or some kind of plant type material. So I don't have anything blooming outside right now, and I just got home from a trip yesterday, so I haven't even made it to the store, but I do have a sizable houseplant collection. So I grabbed one of my houseplants and popped it into a white pot. And I'm gonna attempt to show you a little bit about painting foliage and white objects. I am not gonna make it through this whole painting during this demo because, like I said, I think I bit off a little more than I can chew with this subject matter, but let's take a look at it. Okay, so there it is. Who's scared right now? So, okay. All right, so the palette that I'm gonna be working with today is pretty limited, but it's a fairly standard split primary palette for me to go with. And I'm just using a disposable palette pad right now. I have a large glass palette that I use in my studio when I'm at home pretty often. It's not that large. It's about 16 by 20, but I like these. I use them at home. I use them out in the field. So we've got titanium white, cadmium yellow, Hansa yellow, and yellow ochre. And then I've got cadmium red and alizarin crimson, and I've got ultramarine blue and ivory black. So split primary means 2 of each primary, a warm and a cool version, or a saturated and a desaturated version is another way that I sometimes work it. And yellow ochre here is just a bonus. So I've got my warm yellow, my cool yellow, my warm red and my cool red. And here, I don't really know. I'm going to say warm blue, cool blue, but really the way I think of it when I use ivory black as a blue, which is really the only way I ever think of it, if I want to paint something black, I'm going to mix a black. Like something where the color of the object is black, I'll mix a black. But I have ivory black on my palette almost all the time, and I use it as a blue. And I want it, especially for this subject matter, because I love using it to mix greens. So I've got a saturated blue and a desaturated blue. And I toned my canvas with this lovely runny orange mess right here that I mixed. It's trying to escape the room. It is a mixture of cad red, cad yellow, and ultramarine blue. No white in this. And that's what I use to tone my canvas and do my underpainting. If I need to save time, I'll use burnt sienna often for this. It works about the same way, but I don't know. There's something about I used to use burnt sienna exclusively, but lately I've gotten away from that, and I always tend to kind of use this mixed thing. So I just washed the canvas with a transparent coating of that, and now I'm going to come in and start sketching out my composition. And like I said, holler if you can't see what it looks like. You can see. So like I said, I've got a lot going on here, but hopefully I'll just be able to paint enough of it out for you that you can sort of see what I'm talking about. I'm working on a 12 by 16 vertical rectangle. I've been working with several of you this month, and I really want to come up with an official assignment, I think, based on what a lot of us have been going through together this month about making decisions around what format to paint our paintings in. So you go to the store, you see something beautiful and you say, oh, well, I really want to paint that. And you get it home. Maybe you pick out a couple other objects to go with it. Maybe you've got some colored background stuff you want to throw in, and you decide, all right, well, these are all, it's like when you're cooking, you know, you get a new cookbook and you pick out a recipe and you assemble all the ingredients and you put them in the kitchen counter, and then it's like, okay, well, what pot am I going to cook it in? So you get all your still life, you get your painting ingredients all together, and then I've seen some of you kind of maybe skipping over this important question. What shape and size of canvas am I going to paint this on? And it's not a no-brainer. Like, I kind of wish it was. I wish that I could just, you know, kind of intuitively know, or just blindly reach and grab the first thing and have it work. But it really is a problematic issue for me. Oftentimes, I was just 2 days ago painting and had to go through the process that I've been through with a couple of you this month of, okay, I've got my subject set up. Like, I've found the thing that I'm responding to. I've found the painting that I want to make. Now, what shape and size is it? I just posted on Facebook yesterday, my newest painting of like a jar of honey on a windowsill. So I set that up and I was like, yes, like I know this is the painting that I'm going to make today. But at first I thought vertical rectangle, because there was this interesting countertop that I wanted to include. And I ended up painting it in a square. I got my viewfinder out. I didn't do any sketching, but sketching is super helpful, especially if you're not comfortable looking through a viewfinder. And I pretty much thought it would probably work either way. But how do you make that decision? You know, you need a way to let your artistic intuition work on the problem. And the way that my artistic intuition works is visually. I can't really make that call sometimes unless I look, and that means either looking through a viewfinder or making thumbnail sketches and looking at them. And that's really the best way for me, thumbnail sketches, especially when they're, you know, I can then maybe take a picture of them, look at them all together, get far away from them. So, and this does not have to be a lengthy or agonizing process. Thumbnail sketches can be very cursory, you know, and I like to, if I've narrowed it down to, you know, this is either one thing or another. If I've narrowed it down to two choices, you know, then you don't have to do as many thumbnail sketches. So when I decided that I was going to paint this plant today, I pretty much figured right off that it was going to be a vertical rectangle because of the way that the foliage hangs down. And I did not do a thumbnail sketch because I'm the teacher, so I don't have to. No, I'm kidding. I just, no, I'm hoping that I can demo how I would handle the white thing, and then demo how I will handle the foliage, and not worry like overly much about composition for the purposes of this demo, but just kind of touch on the basic points. I start to make decisions about how much detail I'm going to put in certain very complicated passages. When you have, you know, and this is a very helpful concept for landscape painting also, or if you're painting a still life and you have something complicated like a bunch of grapes or a bowl of cherries or just any subject matter that's pretty cluttered and complicated, you don't need to get really nuts and show us every single thing that's going on with the subject. Often just zooming in and focusing on some of the more, you know, arresting areas where your interest is can be enough, and then the rest of it can kind of be implied. And when you're doing that, you're kind of almost helping your viewer figure out what the focal point is. So certainly, even if I, well, you know, was painting this plant for my own self and, or, you know, as part of my own work, and actually I would like to, I think this would be kind of a fun subject to spend a lot of time with. I've never painted this plant before. This plant is also relatively new to me. I've only had it for about a year. I would not give equal love and attention to every single leaf, because it would just be, I think, kind of overwhelming for the viewer. And so you sort of need to decide it. You need to decide it based on what's in the light. You know, we see less detail in leaves that aren't illuminated strongly by the light source, but also, you know, you think about where's a good spot for my focal point just compositionally. Rule of thirds, right? If you divide the canvas into 3, vertically and horizontally, I've got a good spot right here, more or less. And that's good because actually my main interest that's been drawing me into this subject in the first place happens to fall right here as well. And I'll show you that in just a sec. Right here, I've got something interesting also about to pop off, I think. And so I'm going to pick where I'm going to spend my attention, and a lot of the rest of it can be implied. So this spot right here, what I really love about this, there's this little leaf, and there's nothing so special about this little leaf necessarily. Although the curve of this stem that comes down is kind of pretty to me. It's getting kind of busy back in here, and we have the edge of the bowl there. And all this dark stuff back here, blah. That's all too much busyness back there. But what I really am liking that's happening here is there's a cast shadow from the leaves and the stem. There's this cast shadow right here. Goes over the lip. And then right next to the cast shadow, almost in it, I have the pinpoint highlight from the white. All right, and so I have this wet tone on my canvas, and now that I know this is like, to me even, I'm like, oh, this is very hard to see my drawing, what I've got going on, even to myself. But I'm gonna start in on what I kind of conceptualize as the second phase of my underpainting, where I start focusing on values. So let's say I've got my composition sketched out, more or less planned compositionally. And now I come in, and because I have a wet tone on the canvas, I can pull out some lights and I can put in more darks. But what I like about working on a wet tone canvas as opposed to one that I've put a mid-tone color on and then allowed it to dry is that I can pull out some lights. Now you can do an underpainting, a full underpainting in values and paint with white and then let it dry and paint over that. But you can't paint with the alla prima technique, wet into wet. You can't do that with white paint and then paint right over it while it's still wet. White will get into everything and just really mess you up. So at this point, I'm not working with any white. I don't have any white in the paint that I did my underpainting with at all. I just am using the transparent nature of this paint that's thinned down with Gamsol, and I'm using the white of the canvas to modulate value. And this is the only time during the oil painting process for me that I will use the white of the canvas and transparent paint to modulate value. So at this stage, I'm looking for where are my darkest darks and where are my lightest lights. So my lightest light is right here in this highlight for sure. And my darkest darks are close by that. I've got some really dark stuff happening inside the rim of the pot here because the light source is coming in this way. And when we have a light source hitting a bowl, what tends to happen is it hits the most strongly on the outside closest to the light source. Here's the rim of the bowl. And then it hits again on the inside of the rim of the bowl. And this part gets eclipsed. So this is where the darkest part is. And I know that in my mind, but I'm looking for it with my eyes. I can just get there from observation, but having that knowledge, you know, about the way light travels across form from experience is also helpful to me because I know what to look for. And I'm always drawing. I'm drawing through every phase of a painting. I never stop measuring and drawing and looking. So, but I was saying lightest lights and darkest darks, and there's a large, this is all cast shadow up here, and then there's this little guy sticking up. This is dark. Leaf, and then the cast shadow on the wall. This is on the bowl itself. That's like the shadow side of the bowl, and then there's a cast shadow of the bowl on the wall, and there's not very much contrast over here at all, which is good. It'll stop it from being so much of a focal point. Because I'm taking notes for myself. You know, I'm pointing out where my darkest darks and my lightest lights are, where my points of interest are. I'm like noticing for myself during this process what is turning me on about this subject that I'm looking at. You know, I was intuitively drawn to this for some reason. I don't have to really worry about why, because it's going to become clear to me during this part of the process. Also get a rag and scrub it out. If you really want to get some of that off. I didn't tone it that darkly, so it's not that big of a deal. But if I'm feeling like I'm unable to get it off with the brush, a rag will do it. You want to, cheap paper towels are going to shred up if you try to do this to your canvas, and you'll get little pills of paper towel all over your stuff. So investing in some of these blue towels or using some rags or whatever, cotton rag is good. But yeah, the sooner you hit this, the more light you can pull out. But I like to go back and forth. I really think of it as almost a sculptural process during the underpainting stage, because I can really pick the paint up, put it back down, and move it around to get myself to the level that I want to be at. And I would do more. I would do more with putting in the darks probably, but I'm going to move on and do a little bit of color mixing. I just love this. And I feel like I wish that I had the self-restraint to leave my paintings more unfinished. I wish I could figure out how to leave more of the underpainting, because I really like some of the marks that come from my hand when I'm drawing. Often I'll post work in progress shots on my blog or on Facebook or somewhere, and people will say, "Oh, stop, stop." And I'm like, no, I'm gonna finish the painting. But it's just interesting. It's always sort of knowing when something is done is always part of the artistic struggle. And for most people, I find overworking is really the enemy. I think we talked about this last month when I did the portrait, didn't I? I said, like, if I have infinite time, that's when things go very wrong. And I was talking about this portrait commission that I've been working on from photos, and why one of the reasons that working from photos is so deadly for me is because if I have infinite time with a subject, I'll almost invariably kill it. I need to limit myself in some way. And having a live model or a live sitter to work from, they have to take a break, so you have to take a break. Or they're only there for a few hours, so you really kind of have to capture the essentials, get that important thing done, and then let the rest of it be kind of what it is. So with still life, I'm always shooting for, stopping before I've said too much. All right, so can you all see this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes. So I'm going to do just a little bit of mixing, and I started here working on something for the white bowl. So when I mix paint to paint white objects, I generally start from kind of a flesh tone. You can use a color isolator or just kind of triage any white or gray that you're observing in the world and ask yourself, how light or dark is it compared to the highlight? So I have that real bright highlight on the white pot, and I need to look at the large area of light that's on the white pot and ask myself, that big area that's the light side of the pot, how close is it to that highlight? And then I kind of want to judge if my highlight is going to be white or close to white. It's not going to be pure white, but it's going to be very close to white in value. And then I need to mix something up for the large light shape. The large area on this pot that's closer to the light source, I want that value relationship to be right from the start. So I need to conserve my values. I need to leave myself enough room at the top of the value scale on the light end that I can put that real strong highlight on and have it sing out the way it does to my eye in life. And I'm going to be helped by that, by the fact that I have this real dark shadow next to it too. That's going to be good. All right, so I'm starting to mix into my whites by kind of coming from a Caucasian flesh tone type deal. This is a very creamy white. It's an off-white bowl to begin with, so I'm cheating a little bit, but it's the same idea when you have something white. If you're confused about what color you're seeing, you can look at what colors are happening around it in the room, what other colors you have in the still life. A lot of color information bounces around, so you can just sort of ask yourself what's nearby that might be influencing it, or just if you really can't see what kind of a gray is making up that quote-unquote white object, you really can't see, just decide and go with it. Say to yourself, this is a lavenderish grayish white. I'm gonna say that that's what it is, and that's what I'm gonna mix it with, and just do it. If you can't get that information visually through your eyes, you can always just make a decision and it'll probably work okay. So I mixed this putty-like color pretty much starting from my neutral orange that I did the underpainting with. I grabbed out a little bit of it and I added a bunch of white to it. And now I need to take it down some more away from orange because the pot's not orange. It's a grayish, whitish, peachish something. And so I want to go to the complement of orange to knock some of that orange chroma out of there. So I'm going to go to my ultramarine blue. Thing is shaking around and knocking all over the place. And it gets down to kind of like a, just totally dip that in my cadmium red. Glad I caught that one before it went everywhere. And it kind of comes down to a darker, more putty colored, whitish thing. That's pretty dark value-wise, but it might work for some of the shadows. And the shadow side I see as being a little bluer, but maybe a little violet too. So I'm going to grab some alizarin crimson and put it in there. I didn't mix up a purple, which would probably be a good idea for me at this point. I often will paint with a tube purple on my palette. I like dioxazine purple. Mostly I use a tube purple on my palette because otherwise I just have to use so much more of the alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue. And I like dioxazine purple because it replicates, for me, the purple that's made from mixing alizarin crimson and ultramarine blue most closely. It's much stronger, however, than the mixture of the two paints is going to be. So just keep that in mind if you use it. But I like to have some purple around. Just really good for knocking back anything that gets too yellow. Whether you conceptualize mixing grays as coming from a blue-orange place or a purple-yellow place, it's really all the same thing. So whatever your brain likes to go to the most. But when we're mixing whites, we're pretty much making grays from neutrals. And the way that we get there is from pairs of complements. So if I start from this orange, then I add blue to it. But if I feel like it's a lavenderish gray and I want to start from a purple, then I'm going to, what a beautiful purple that is, eh? I'm going to knock that back with yellow and kind of a red purple. So I'm going to go with my cool yellow. See what that does. Eee! And that gets close to this one value-wise. How much? It's so much more red. I'm going to put some yellow ochre in it. So from purple yellow to orange blue, I can get to the same gray. It's all the same ingredients. That's warmer, much warmer. Kind of like that. Now, often, there are a lot of artists who just mix with the brush as they paint along. And that works for them, and they know how to control it and not get muddy and, you know, remember what they did, remember how they mixed something so that they can get back to it whenever they want to. But I really find it helpful to do a lot of pre-mixing before I start painting. And that's not everybody's technique, but I think that it's really helpful to be able to work back and forth across your edges and have, you know, paint from one object and paint from another object, to be able to go back and forth between the background and the foreground and not have to reinvent the wheel every time with your brush. And I spend a fair amount of time on it, the mixing phase, but oftentimes people are so impatient. I want to paint, and they, you know, they skip over a lot of this action, and it doesn't serve them well going forward. Time spent mixing is time spent painting, in my opinion. It's vital. You're seeing colors in your still life. You're working those colors, working your mental muscles, your artist's eye, giving all those things a workout. And I will hold up my palette knife right to the still life, close one eye, and kind of judge. It's not exact because the light that's here on my palette knife is not the same as the light that's over there on the still life, but it helps me know if I'm getting close, hue-wise, value-wise, and then I can just judge it. But really, I can't be certain about anything until it gets onto the canvas and I establish some relationships, sort of set the parameters for my world, as it were.
How do you know how much to mix too?
Oh.
If I find myself either mixing not enough or mixing too much, or just experience?
No. it's a crapshoot.
Okay.
No, you know, it's kind of experience, and part of it is it kind of just is, it turns out being as much as it is because of how much I'm fiddling with it. But yeah, it with experience, yeah, and you want to err on the side of more, possibly, because the thing is, especially with a limited palette, you can always change it and take it in a different direction. If it feels like it's getting out of control, the color pile, if it just isn't useful for anything, you can turn it into something else that's going to make a larger pile of paint, of course. But there we go. Did you see what I did? Like, this was not really working for me quite as well, and I was starting to create a large pile of paint, but it was getting there and I wanted to keep working with it, so I divided it in half. I moved half of it over, and I kept going on this kind of color mixing journey with this half and left that half. Now I can do something else with that half. It'll be there for a, you know, that kind of purple if I want that for anything. But I'm gonna move this over, just move half of it over and keep changing that. The other thing is, I mean, it really is not cool running out of something that's very, very useful halfway through a painting and then either not noticing that you've run out of it until you're just grabbing for the next closest thing on your palette, which is not right, and your painting gets out of control very, very quickly. I need to do some yellows. I mean greens. All right, so I made this green. This is ultramarine and Hansa yellow, and it is green, isn't it? Yeah. There's nothing up there that looks like this. This is like Crayola crayons out of the box green. And it's shocking sometimes when I notice and think about just how neutralized all the colors that we perceive as very vivid actually are out there in the world. Everything is so grayed down. And I just put a pretty sizable dollop of alizarin crimson in that, and now it's feeling a little more well-behaved. Possibly not the exact green that I'm seeing. Still probably too vivid. I'm going to put some yellow ochre in it. So I think I mentioned before, now I'm mixing for like the shadow side of the leaves. Or maybe a mid-tone. That's getting better. Better. Pretty dull, but I think it's going to be good. So I mentioned liking to have ivory black around for making making greens, and I do like having ivory black around to make greens, and I learned about this by working with the Zorn palette. You know, all the beautiful greens that you can make with yellow ochre and ivory black. That's pretty much all you get access to when you're working with the Zorn palette as far as greens are concerned. And when I have more vivid yellows around on the palette, it really doesn't look like much. That mixture of yellow ochre and ivory black doesn't really hardly look like green at all. But it's a very interesting opaque kind of mid-tone olive green that it makes. I don't much see that in here except in the stems. But I love to make a dark green out of Hansa yellow and ivory black. Hansa yellow is very transparent, so it makes beautiful dark greens. Transparent colors are great for making darks. That's why you can use alizarin crimson, maybe with like a phthalo green to make a really beautiful black because they're both so transparent. You mix with opaque colors like cadmium yellow, like yellow ochre, it kind of lightens them. It's not that there's white in the paint, but because the paint is so opaque, it gets lighter. So you see how beautiful and dark. There's no white in this. There's no white in this, but there's yellow ochre in it. So it feels a little bit lighter than this one that came from the transparent yellow. And if I mix, well, that was ultramarine blue and Hansa yellow, wasn't it? If I mix ivory black with some cadmium yellow, it's going to be a lot lighter. Still an interesting green. And it's hard to see. Let's see if I can get my computer to kind of show you. That's ivory black and cadmium yellow, and that's ivory black and Hansa yellow. The transparent yellow allows me to mix a much darker green. I like that. Okay. I really have not added very much white. I don't add very much white when I'm mixing, unless I'm mixing things that are going to be white, where the local color is white. Then I have to. And even then, I kind of don't add as much as I might otherwise do. Just because I can always add more white later, but if you put in a lot on your palette, it can be kind of hard to walk it back from that. All right. More bluish. I like to lighten with yellow also. Instead of using white, try using yellow, especially with reds and warm colors. That's close. And I can start judging value relationships right on my palette. So I can see the relationship between this and this right here and say to myself, well, does that feel like the relationship between the light parts of the leaves and the dark parts of the leaves up there? And it kind of does. So it leads me to think that I'm on the right track. We'll put some white in this. All right. Now, I know I didn't mix up enough white because I have all this background is also white. So I really need a lot more. And if I was going to paint this whole painting, I would go through a very sizable amount of white paint out of the tube. But that's okay because I have extra. Onward. So let's see what I got. It's always sort of a tough moment. And that ended up rubbing out a bunch of my underdrawing. Interesting. It's always sort of a tough moment when I come to the canvas and you start putting color on over your underpainting, because the underpainting is this like really vivid orange. So it becomes a little bit tough to judge for the first little while. But you just kind of have to go with it. And I like to put, little bits and patches of color around in different spots. I don't ever want to paint like one whole part of a painting until it's completely done. Because it's difficult to judge whether something is correct. I only can judge things relative to what's happening around it with my eye in the world and in my painting as well. I need some medium. I've been using a lot of this stuff lately. Solvent-free gel, Campbell.
So what do you use that for?
It's a painting medium. So I've been using it to get the paint to be a good consistency. So I can use Gamsol. I put it up here. I can use Gamsol to thin the paint and make it more runny. But I don't really always want to use that through every stage of the painting, because it also makes it quite a bit more transparent. So, but sometimes I want to change the consistency of the paint so that it feels like it's going onto the brush more smoothly. One of my main goals is to get the paint onto the brush really efficiently and then get it onto the canvas really efficiently so that I can preserve these kind of juicy, satisfying brush strokes. Is the plant moving? Could that be happening? Why does my drawing feel so weird? They do that. I don't know how many of you have ever tried to paint tulips, but they will move, especially under a light bulb. Well, once you cut them, they just sort of flail around. Weird. Haunted tulips. Okay. So everybody has a paint consistency that they are comfortable with. Some people are comfortable painting with toothpastey paint, and I wish them luck. But I like a much more buttery, smooth consistency. And I can get it by mixing more oil into my paint with the palette knife as I'm doing it. I'll sometimes use straight walnut oil as a medium, or I can do it. I've painted plenty of paintings with just Gamsol as a medium, especially if you're not going to do a lot of thick layers of wet on wet. That works okay. But it's nice to have something around, whether it's some walnut oil or some kind of alkyd medium, liquid, alkyd gel, just to be able to change the consistency of the paint without making it real thin and runny, which is what Gamsol would do. It would make it pretty runny.
Sarah, what did you use? The tube medium for?
Well, I'm just adding it into my paint now to sort of get it to a flowy enough consistency that I feel like it's loading onto the brush nicely.
So you put it on your palette and then used your palette knife to mix it in with the paint?
No, I put it on my palette and then I'm using my brush to mix it into the paint. So
Okay.
Before I go to grab paint, where am I going next here? Before I go to grab some paint next, I'm going to just dip it into this gel and work it into my brush like that. And then my brush is like nice and loaded up.
What size is that brush?
4.
Do you usually paint with a 4?
Uh-huh.
What about your brush strokes? Like what direction? What makes you, how do you decide that you want it horizontal or vertical or an angle? Or because to me that pot looks like it's got a lot of horizontal like direction from the picture. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah. So, okay, I can see what you're saying. You mean like it feels like it has horizontal lines like sometimes ceramic things get.
Right.
Because they're made that way. Yeah, I'm more thinking about it in terms of painting around the form not the lines that I'm seeing on the thing per se, but kind of describing the form almost in a geometric or planar way with my brush strokes. And the other thing is I also think about it this way, like within this pot, I've got an area of shadow, the shadow side, and I've got an area of light here. And so oftentimes I'll make my brush strokes conform to that value shape within a shape. So within the big shape of this pot, I've got this, well, there's shadows crossing it and stuff, and I'm trying not to see too much of that right now, but I've got this value shape of the light part of the bowl thing. And I kind of want to tailor my brush marks to that shape. And then I come over here and it's the shadow side. And I kind of want to see what's going on over here, and I'll make my brush marks match the shape of the value that I'm seeing over there. Does that make sense? Because that is definitely the way that I think about it. Here I've got kind of like a little mid-tone thing going on, or there's some, it looks a little bit warmer to me right there. And I see it kind of in that triangle shape. It's a little bit of a cast shadow, I think, from that leaf. And so I paint it in that shape. So and sometimes I'll have my brush marks describing the form where I think that's helpful. It just often is not helpful, and we intuitively want to do that, but when like something is round, like if you're painting an apple and you're giving me all these like this like whirlpool of circular brush strokes, it almost creates like a tube effect or a tornado effect rather than showing solid form. But we think it's going to work. We really do. So very, very often I see people struggling because they just are touching the canvas too many times, far too many times. One of the main, well, we talked about overworking things, but you know, just making too many marks on the canvas is a huge part of that. The more times you touch the canvas, the more blended you're making everything that you've done. And it's almost to the point where you are picking up paint after a certain point rather than putting down paint. And that freshness of brushstrokes that we all love and want to shoot for gets obliterated, and it's very frustrating. So the trick is just say more with less. See how little you can get away with doing. It's not laziness, although I like to joke that it is. It's putting something down and giving it a chance to be done. You want to give what you've painted a chance to be good enough, and it probably is, but it's really hard to judge if what I did is working sometimes until I go and paint somewhere else for a little while. I have to go and paint you know, some of the other parts of this bowl before I can judge if whether what I've done so far is effective. Or maybe I have to go and paint some of the negative space, or I have to go and paint in like a whole other area of the painting.
So you don't complete one part of the painting.
I don't think of it that way.
Yeah.
I don't think of it as, oh, I finished the bowl, now I can move on to the background. But often I will say, well, now I'm going to move on to the background, and something I paint over here will make something that I've already done over here feel done.
Yep.
Yeah, it'll make it done. So I don't worry about whether an area is done or not before I move on from it. All I need to know is I'm done working on it right now. But yeah, trying to touch the canvas as few times as possible, and certainly more trips, fewer touches of the canvas in between trips back to the palette. You don't want to get some paint on your paintbrush and then be touching the canvas with it 18 times. So I'm always looking at value relationships. Very hard. They say color gets all the credit, but value does all the work, and that is certainly true. It doesn't much matter what color, you know, I don't, if the color is not too saturated, if it's not too discordant, if it's not just out and out wrong, I can get away with a lot color-wise. But if the value relationships aren't working, I really will not be able to get away with that. So I'm much more worried about seeing and capturing what's going on value-wise. So what I painted 2 days ago, I painted this jar of honey and a camellia on a windowsill, and it was backlit, and it was very challenging, and I was kind of thought I was nuts, but I was very drawn to the subject, so I decided to try it anyway, and it worked out pretty good. But talk about having to do a lot of squinting and comparing my values. It was, you know, when a subject is intimidating, we really need to tell ourselves, you almost need to play like a mental trick on yourself and say, well, you know, it's not that I'm painting this backlit subject on a windowsill, or, you know, forget about the fact that I'm painting glass or something, you know, this white ceramic object that I'm so intimidated about. We have to fight that intimidation because it shuts us down.
And the cut glass that you had in that thing. I can't imagine what a challenge that must have been.
It wasn't that hard.
Really?
I'm telling you, it really wasn't.
I would think that the honey jar would be difficult because it really glowed, and the cast shadow in front of it, you know, that's really hard to pull off.
Yeah, it really is a matter of painting what you see, not what you think you see. Or painting what you see, not what you know is there. Any subject that intimidates you, it's more of a mental barrier than an actual barrier, and we really need to everybody's different, and it's just in the way that we sort of try to figure out how best to motivate ourselves to actually get to the easel and paint, which is what we somehow, it's like what we most want to do, and we just can't always get there. So we need to think of like tricks and ways to incentivize ourselves to get ourselves to do what we want to do, whether it's, painting or exercising or eating healthy or just whatever it is, but also kind of knowing how to break through the barriers of intimidation that surround these difficult subjects, because when you're playing it safe and you're painting something that doesn't scare you, you're also not painting something that excites you terribly most of the time. You know what I mean? So those of us who get off on taking risks need to know how to manage the anxiety around that, is another way to put it. So that when I talk about working back and forth across edges, this is a lot of what I mean. I painted the leaf out into the vase, bowl, whatever this thing is, pot, and now I'm painting the pot back into the leaf. And the same thing with the shadow. I never want to tiptoe up to the edge of something, stop, and then retreat. And so my underpainting, I have no interest in preserving my underpainting, and I get very, very frustrated with students who do this. I call it haloing, because if I was gonna paint like this leaf, and I came up to this leaf and I have my underdrawing and I'm really, really concerned about not losing this, right? This happens to disastrous effect in portrait. But if I paint like right up to the edge and stop, and then I come in from the background and I paint right up to the edge and stop, what have I done? It's really kind of hard to see, but I've created this like halo of underdrawing that's sticking through. And as I get more paint on the canvas, that becomes very noticeable and very problematic. So what I like to do is, my goal is to obliterate my underpainting drawing, a thing that I spent a third of my painting time on, that I worked so hard on. That's okay. All of that stuff is still in here and it's still helping me, and I can get my drawing back at any time. I should never be afraid of losing my underdrawing, because as long as I've got my still life, it's all still there. I never have to worry about, I'm going to lose something, or if I paint over my drawing, it's going to be out of control. I'm drawing through every single phase of the painting. So I'm going to paint this leaf right out into the background. I can paint it all the way out to the edge if I want. And come in. I like to paint out beyond the margins. It gives me another chance to draw, and I love to draw. And this might just look like I'm just coloring it in, but I'm actually grabbing from different piles of green, slightly different piles of green, and changing it up just a little bit. I have all these pre-mixed piles that I made, but I'm also amending them as I go. I'm shifting the temperature slightly. I'm adding in things from my tubes to the pre-mixed piles. My pre-mixed piles don't stay, and I don't stick to them slavishly as I'm going forward. But really, I have to get a lot of paint onto a canvas before I get to the stage where I'm making critical decisions. So I don't worry. This is, everybody has their favorite phase of a painting. Some people really love the home stretch, or, some people like to wallow around in the middle. I like the beginning because I can't screw it up in the beginning. The world is my oyster. So I really need to get a fair amount of paint onto a canvas before my decisions start to feel critical.
But you almost always are going beyond the edge rather than staying more inside of that. I mean, it makes more sense that you're going beyond the edge.
I am going beyond the edge, almost always. And so I just scraped some paint away with my back of my brush, and anyway, that kind of fine detail work I don't really need to be doing right now, but no rules. Okay. Yes, I'm going out beyond the edge, and then I'm going to come back in from the other direction. Sorry, I'm
Sarah, I have a question about, well, I guess it's kind of a composition question. So when you were setting up this little composition, and you got your white pot and you put it on a white pedestal and you put it in, it's basically a white background.
yeah.
But all of those whites are different. Were you consciously looking for warm whites against cool whites? Because it seems the pedestal is like a very cool white, and then the pot's a very warm white. Or was
It wasn't, sadly, it wasn't that conscious of a decision. I tried a couple backgrounds and I didn't really like it. Was color there? No, I did not think of it that way, as a contrast of different temperatures of white. That would be a very legitimate way to do it, though. It would be a legitimate way to approach it mentally.
but it did turn out so nicely as a very, the green and the different whites with that terracotta rim.
Well, I was thinking about that. Yeah, that's the only that I was thinking about it less in terms of all the different temperatures of whites. But that could be what the painting would be about. But I liked the contrast. Well, if I painted all of this out, it would be almost, the only real color in this painting would be the terracotta and the green. So that's a red-green complementary color composition.
Oh, okay.
And everything else is white. But it isn't really white. It just is maybe less chromatic. I don't know. I think I'm not. Anyway, this is a large painting and it will need quite a bit more paint on it before it starts to come clear. But I'm thinking, am I showing enough form on the pot? It's kind of hard for me to judge. So you know, I try to have fun with it. What is lighter or darker right now? I'm not capturing that value relationship very well. Cast shadow is lighter behind it. And then I can paint back into the leaf here, come in with something dark, reinforce that edge, draw it again. But how much do I really need to say to get the point across here? And I'm kind of drawing these leaves the same way that you all have seen me draw round objects many, many times. I kind of take it in line segments. You're not going to see me trying to capture the entire contour line of each leaf with a continuous rounded line motion. You sort of see me giving it these little separated line segments, and that's so that I will make sure that I'm always looking back at my still life as much as I'm looking at my painting. All the information that I want and need is in my still life, and very, very little of it is in my painting at this point. As we get to the end, as I get to the end of a painting, it starts to be much more important what's happening on my canvas than what's happening in the still life. But that's only the very, very end. These highlights on the leaves, I'm going straight to what I painted this with. I'm going to this to put highlights on these leaves, because when I look and compare, I don't see much difference. Certainly not in value, and not really in color or temperature between what's happening on the leaf in the highlights and what's happening on the pot. Maybe it's a little more yellow on this side. But I really want to keep as much color as I can at all times in everything. Oh, that's nice. So not going to white when that might be my first inclination.
When you were mixing the paints, it seemed like the putty color was less gray than what it appears on the painting.
Yeah, and partly that's because of this orange that feels so vibrant as the underpainting. It's really not that vibrant of an orange. I mean, on my palette, it felt kind of drab, this orange, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it starts to feel very bright and golden on the canvas, and so it does kind of make this feel not very. Yeah, it makes the gray whites feel a lot more drab than they might otherwise be. But when I get the canvas more filled in, they might not feel that way anymore. Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a puzzle. You know, I go around and I'm constantly comparing every little area to what is immediately next to it. And it's like putting together the pieces of a large jigsaw puzzle. You capture one relationship, and then you go and investigate and capture another relationship, and around and around and around like that until you've sort of got them all hammered out. And sometimes midstream, you find that you're on the wrong track, and you can regroup. Yeah. You know, sometimes regrouping looks like scraping it off and starting over. If that has to happen, my advice is be brave about it. There's no painting that ever did not benefit from being taken back to square one and reworked. The second or third time you have to draw something, you're going to do a better job. just hands down, always across the board, the second or third time you are forced to draw something, you will draw it better. In my last workshop, very few students were willing to scrape their paintings and start over, even at an early stage. But the ones who did got far better results, shockingly better results. And it's good because it lets me show everybody else, like, you see this? She wiped this off 2 times at the beginning. And now look how beautiful it is. So we have to, sometimes you have to nuke and pave, which is one of my favorite ways to think about it. Nuke and pave. So here's what I meant about selective focus on a subject. I've got this leaf here that I'm kind of interested in. We knew I was very interested in this leaf going in. And so I'm going to put a lot more detail and observation into this leaf. And then I come back here, like this stuff, these leaves that are going on behind the bowl. I need to show that value relationship so that I can create this edge of the bowl with it, but I'm not going to paint those leaves back there. They're in the background. They're secondary supporting characters at best. I only want to show them in, as much as I have to show that there's something there, but I don't really care, what. You're going to believe me that it's leaves because there's already all these other leaves here happening. And so I pick and choose which ones to focus on. Like if you're painting a forest scene, you're not going to render every single tree. The ones that are farther away from your eye are going to be more blurry, more just less detailed. We pick out the areas where we want. One of the ways you direct your viewer's attention where you want it to go is by giving them more detail to look at in the areas where you want them to linger. I'm running out of my greens. And that's okay. But I need to notice that I'm running out of my greens. And I have a couple options when that happens. I can go work on a different area, but eventually I'm going to have to finish the leaves. So at some point I'm going to need to remix. And it's probably a better idea for me to do that sooner rather than later while I still remember how I made these things, right? So more focus, more detail, and less detail. But everything gets painted from the general to the specific. Raise your hand if you're tired of hearing me talk about that. Just checking.
I can't wait to see this finish. This is just looking, this is looking lovely.
Well, thank you. You're always so kind. And I would not say that I totally, no, it's not done by any stretch of the imagination, this highlight did not go on in a very satisfying way, did it? I think that I didn't get dark enough with the light part here, or maybe this cast shadow is also not dark enough. I think that's part of it. Because when I squint at the leaf, the dark part of the leaf and the darkest part of the cast shadow are really quite similar. They're quite close to each other. And so I need to always be willing to kind of reassess my work.
The white pot is looking more puttyish than it did earlier. It looked more gray earlier. I don't know now, maybe with more of the leaves done, it's kind of changed.
I know putting the green leaves made all the difference.
Yeah, I think so too. It did help. And just, you know, sometimes it's a matter of a painting goes through kind of an awkward phase and you just have to stick with it. I also have this nice kind of bluish highlight over here from the window. Yeah, you just have to kind of keep working with it sometimes. Paintings go through awkward phases like children.
Okay, all right.
That's too dark. Anyway, all right. So 2 highlights on there. So this is starting to become a focal point, this area here.
Mm-hmm.
I build up more and more detail, kind of blend it selectively. But areas, other areas like this, it's really very abstract back here, would stay very abstract. This kind of area of the painting would end up, now the leaf that was in the front here, the one that's overlapping and coming in the front would have more detail. And I would certainly work that edge and maybe worry less about it as it gets over to the edge of the canvas, because we don't really need that much detail. I want to keep the viewer looking in the middle. Edges, working the edges are much more important than working anything else. But a lot of this leaves in the background, and that layer of space in the painting, I would end up working a lot like what you saw in the painting that I just showed of the honey jar on the windowsill. What's outside the window is largely just an abstract painting. All right. Questions, comments?
You make it look so easy.
I appreciate you saying that. I recognize that I bit off way more than I could show you in a painting in 2 hours this morning. But I hope that I managed to communicate, you know, a few things about my thought process going into a painting like this, and then sort of how I would take it. But this is really very much how I would start it. All right. Well, thank you all very much. And I'll see you soon. Thanks a lot.
Bye,
All right.
Sarah.
Bye.